Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thankful that you give me, for WWF, the opportunity to address you in this keynote speech. WWF, as you know or not know, is the largest private environmental NGO worldwide. I don't want to tell you what we're doing all, but let me tell you that WWF has a track record on working with businesses, with consumers, with trade unions, on creating footprint criteria, not necessarily carbon, but in generally trying to promote voluntary high-level standards for certain products and services and roundtables in the developing countries, but also in developed countries. Some of those work, some don't, to be honest with you. The products of this criteria and those standards are only as good as the participants are and as how progressive the participating companies are in particular. So that as a kind of disclaimer, but to give you a kind of good example, WWF had been initially starting and still is supportive very much of two distinct labels, which you should know in Europe. In other parts of the world is the FSC label, the Forest Stewardship Council label for sustainable forestry, which now has a market share of between 6 and 8%, depending on the year, of all traded wood worldwide, which is very good. And the MSC, the Marine Stewardship Council, which has a much lower market share simply because fish is difficult to certify. Trees are standing, fish is swimming away. There are a couple of look, but MSC is one of the preferred standards for sustainable fisheries, increasingly being asked for by consumers because we face also crises of overfishing as crises of deforestation, just to add the dimension to the carbon challenge we are facing. So I think that this is a more comprehensible approach WWF is taking on a couple of products. What I will do is I will talk to you a little bit about the 100% renewable energy for businesses. What does it mean? Put this down. Our take on renewable energy sources. Second, overview on fuels, businesses, and renewable energy sources. Where are we currently? And certainly, intervention options and necessities, not only by the voluntary market in terms of renewables, but also by the policy sector, which should be, I think, one of the foremost priorities for us, because I think we all agree that voluntary labeling and roundtable agreements do not offset or substitute strong policy making and legislation. I think that should be said up front. And fourthly, what we do on voluntary approaches together with the business sector and others. Windmate, not talking much about that one. My friend Henrik will talk about this later. Green labels, new certification schemes we have in pipeline, etc. Our take on renewable energies. This is a vision, basically, we released last year, which shows us and shows the world that the world can go to 100% renewables. Mind you, not just electricity, 100% renewable energy by 2050. Actually, the work of Ecofys, the global consultancy, which lasted about 2 years with us, arrived at 95%. 100% wasn't possible because a couple of conditions were set, which also included that we look into technologies which are currently available and are already on the shelf, albeit they being immature at this point in time, but they should be available. So we have not looked into some kind of exotic technologies which may play a major role in the future, such as highly efficient algae, or let's say a quite substantive renewable hydrogen network. But it shows us 95%. I think we're in the ballpark of 100%. So our vision is 100% renewables by 2050. And that means, and I have to say that one, I heard a couple of times in the morning and I hear it elsewhere, the move, and I'm not blaming anyone, we need to go to low carbon economies. Everyone is talking about low carbon these days, ladies and gentlemen. It's Shell, it's BP, it's NGOs, it's even the government of Saudi Arabia recently talked about low carbon development. I think we are not in the best company here, to be honest. I think we should be more precise and concise, because low carbon means many things to many people. We are saying we want to go to zero carbon. No nuclear, zero carbon. At least that's where we are coming from. To give you a couple of summaries on our energy report, is this is basically, I'm not going to detail the overall development of energy consumption between the year 2000 and 2050 worldwide. the various fuels involved, and you've seen that basically fossil fuels on top and nuclear being phased out, almost 95%, renewables 5%, mainly natural gas remaining, a little bit of coal, but oil is phased out, and the rest is being renewables. Renewable electricity and biofuels, sustainable biofuels. We cannot go to 100% renewables at this point in time with our current knowledge without accounting for bioenergies for certain sectors which cannot be replaced. Let's be very honest. We can say we shouldn't work on biofuels because there are lots of impacts of biofuels on food security, nature. We know that one, but then we can't go to 100% renewables based on current scientific knowledge. So, but what we have done as well is what you see is we put as a kind of precondition for the study strong energy efficiency and conservation in the system. So overall, and this is basically final energy consumption expressed in exajoule per year globally. We grow our energy consumption until 2020 and then decline basically on the status of 2000 without compromising on the services and the products delivered. Simply energy efficiency, material efficiency on a very high level. Based again on studies by Ecofis and others which showed us that in theory we could have energy efficiency improvements or let's say energy intensity improvements per year of between 3.5 to 4%, based on the technological potentials. I'm not talking about the bottlenecks which are in the system here, which prevent that those low-hanging fruits are being harvested, but technologically, economically, this is simply possible. The barriers are non-technical, the barriers are political to that one, let's be honest. Anyway, in order to basically come to 100% renewables, and the best megawatt is a negawatt, as we all know, energy efficiency is a precondition to also bring the costs down and to reduce the amount of biofuels in the system. The remaining, this is what I said, that's how we worked in the scenario on the limit demand for energy through conservation efficiency, and second, use renewable energies to fill remaining demand. So what was basically a modeling study, top down, bottom up, based on 12 regional center studies from the 12 regional key regions of the world, from China to Europe, Latin America, North America, Africa, etc. The same shape of the curve you will see in the study, which is on the website. Overall, let's say the carriers of energy give you an idea. I don't want to go into detail. There's bio in there, blue, red, yellowish, and pinkish, mainly for shipping, aviation, but also some industrial fuels, which currently cannot be replaced with non-bioenergies. But the other renewables in gray at the bottom are growing quite drastically. Those are the wind, solar, concentrated solar power, geothermal, and partly hydropower. Mainly electricity, because electrification is also one of the key issues to come to a zero carbon development, because electricity is inherently the most efficient and clean energy carrier if based on renewables. Summary again, the same shape. Business as usual, based on the IEA assessment, what energy outlook would bring the world to basically a doubling of energy consumption compared to what we have assumed would happen by 2050. So the biggest wedge of the study is basically the reduction of energy consumption with energy efficiency and material efficiency. So you could even argue the study is more energy conservation, energy efficiency study than a renewable energy study. If we look at the sectoral world energy demand, then you see that currently mainly three sectors. It's industry in red, buildings in yellowish, and transport in blue require more or less the same energy for delivering their services and their products. We have assumed in the study that we take actions on all sectors in parallel. What does not work if we want to go to a zero carbon economy? That we'll pick the lowest hanging fruits first, look at the most cost-effective options, and address the other issues later. If we want to stay below 2-degree global warming as a paradigm, which countries have agreed to, then we need to have actions in all sectors, in the energy sector, but also in other sectors, let's say in agriculture and forests, which I'm not talking about here. So all three actors, industry, buildings, and transport, independent of their costs, and we have also quite substantive cost analysis in the study, which I'm not showing here, but please have a look at that one on our website, all take action simultaneously and land again by 2050, again with a similar share of their final energy demand in society, each about 1/3. Comparing the global energy demand of our study with other studies which have been out in the last couple of years, you see at the bottom what I called the most ambitious scenario in blue, plotted against the final energy or primary energy consumption, is our scenario developed by Ecofys, followed closely by the advanced revolution scenario of Greenpeace, which has many similarities to our study. But then you see the other studies, the World Energy Outlook, a couple of other studies, Shell blueprints, for instance, in red, basically foresees a doubling of energy consumption. Well, this is Shell, of course, they want to sell their stuff. And some of the reference scenarios of the IPCC, what would happen with energy consumption if nothing is happening, and then we see skyrocketing energy consumption in the future, which certainly is a non-option. The only sector which is growing substantively in terms of meaningfulness, in terms of share, is the electricity sector in our scenario. It's a tripling of overall final energy consumed, a tripling. And the biggest growth is, if you look at bluish and yellowish, is wind and solar. People may not disagree on this. Some say, my friends of the offshore wind industry say, why is offshore wind so small, onshore is so large? Why is PV so large and CSP is much smaller? Forget that one, that's not the point. The point is there's enough in for everyone. Everyone will grow as long as it's part of a sustainability agenda. I think that's the main message. And whatever happens in 40 years, no one knows, but this is just one option out of many others. It's based on the current, or let's say the last year's cost assumptions. You could argue if we would now do the study again, probably PV would be higher based on the observed strong cost reductions we have been seeing. Geothermal would be higher as well, and others would be lower. That's fine. But the main point is 100% renewables is possible. That's the main point. What does it mean to CO2 emissions? Basically, we have included the life cycle emission of the energy sector as well. This is in yellowish at the bottom of this graph. And this is mainly CO2 from renewables from bioenergy. Although we have included sustainability, have assumed sustainability practice, no biofuels in protected areas, no competition with food security, still there are remaining emissions from the bioenergy sector, because bioenergy sector by definition is not carbon neutral. Let's be very honest on that one. That needs to change. There are remaining emissions. Still, there are advantages compared to fossil fuels if done sustainable, but it's wrong to assume there are no emissions. So we have included that one, but overall, the energy sector will reduce its emissions by more than 80% based on the Ecofys scenario by 2050. The remaining grayish one is the remaining 5% of fossil fuels in that scenario. So I think the energy sector has to do and can do the largest share of bringing emissions down. Now we come to industry. We have, with Ecofys, basically separated out industry in a couple of sectors. And this is a summary thing. We have indexed industry according to OECD and non-OECD countries, and then to so-called sector A and B. A is the energy-intensive sector, and B is the non-energy intensive manufacturing. Energy-intensive sector is chemicals, steel, aluminum, paper, pulp. You know the sector. It's very well defined. Whereas the rest of the industry sector is manufacturing, engineering, low energy intensive production. And that's what I've told my colleagues in developing countries. Going down substantively with energy efficiency or energy consumption does not mean we curtail your growth in developing countries, needed growth in developing countries, on your activities. Activities being defined as product output of a certain sector. And you see that industry B and industry A in both in non-OECD countries, developing countries, are growing substantively. We have not questioned the growth of the product output. We have assumed and accepted that GDP is growing ahead as business as usual. We have assumed and accepted population growth as normal. One may question that one and say there's a limit to growth. Fine, this was not the job of the study. We have assumed to also have support by developing countries that we have not curtailed your growth. And you see that the non-energy intensive industrial production manufacturing growth of products is more than doubling between now and 2050. And also the energy-intensive growth, Industry A, is almost doubling, whereas it's slightly decreasing from structural reasons in OECD countries, at least the energy-intensive sector. This is based on industry data. This is not because we have assumed leakage. This is basically because industry is going where the growing market is. They produce where the growing market is. And you have a natural development of energy-intensive products to be produced more and more in emerging economies and less in the OECD. That's a natural development. So again, this is the A sector on the left side, the 4 sectors, energy-intensive sector globally, paper, aluminum, cement, and steel. Mind you, chemicals is missing here at this point in time, but the figure wouldn't be very different. The increase of the output of those products basically doubling between the year 2000 and 2050, staying in line with assumed business as usual development. But what we have assumed as well at the bottom of the graph, you see at the bottom, for those 4 sectors, substantive improvements of energy intensity per product output, energy consumption per ton of steel, per ton of cement, and so on and so on, based on observed and tested energy efficiency, and I should say also material efficiency improvements. So we have assumed that what is out there already as kind of tested pilot schemes for strong energy efficient cement, energy efficient steel, becomes, so to speak, the blueprint and the best practice for the rest of the sector over time. And then you see that despite doubling the amount of your output of those products, you still have right side the final energy consumption of those sectors also decreasing. The 4 colors, red, black, yellow, red, and blue, depict these 4 sectors, paper, aluminum, cement, and steel. So even the industry, despite a strong growth of product output, decreases energy consumption over time and goes back to 2000 level. The same is true for transport sector and for business and for building, which I'm not showing here. Now, overview on business, fuels, and renewable energies. Where do we stand? What is the reality check here? The global energy consumption trends, mind you, I have not put in key renewables here. This is coming from the statistical review of BP, but is confirmed by IEA in general, gives us a dire picture. It's basically defeat. Let's be honest. Oil, coal, and gas are still running the show, whereas nuclear and hydro are growing slightly or even stabilizing, like nuclear in the last years, but on a much lower scale. In case you prefer nuclear and hydro as low-carbon fuels, which we don't bank on those. The show is being run by oil, coal, and gas. Whether we like it or not, they still determine the development of our energy system at this point in time, if you look at the macro scale. That's where I say the glass is half empty. I come to the glass is half full message as well later. But oil is still the largest energy carrier, followed by coal and by gas. So keep that in mind. That's the reason why our economies are so volatile to increased oil and eventually gas prices, which are trailing behind the oil prices. In terms of global CO2 emission, things look different because coal has an inherently higher carbon content. Coal is by far now the largest sectoral emitter, followed by oil and gas, which is supposedly a transition fuel, but may develop life on its own with shale gas and may dwarf basically oil and coal in the future as well and not contribute to climate mitigation. That's where we need to go globally. From the IPCC, I don't want to go much in this picture, from the IPCC, from the last forced assessment report, based on the various scenarios, based on the various stabilization scenarios compiled by the IPCC, just look at the button, in order to have a decent chance to stay around or below 2-degree global warming, which is an agreed target by most countries, if not all countries, in the UNFCCC, in the Climate Convention, by the US, by China, by many others, by the European Unions. We need to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions, not only carbon, close to zero by 2050, 2060, and then even go negative later on. But being zero by the second part of the century is essential to have a decent chance to stay below 2 degrees. I can skip that one. Now, a couple of facts in industry and energy. Industry consumes about 32% of all energy used. That excludes the feedstock, which is used mainly by chemical and other companies for producing plastic, and other substitutes. And currently and increasingly, 17% of all oil is being used for plastic production and for non-energy purposes. And the amount is increasing because we plastify our world. If I would add that one, the energy content used by industry is even higher. But let's look at the energy which is consumed physically. Industry emits about 10.5 gigatons CO2 per year. That means basically, for those who are not familiar, it's 1/5 of all global greenhouse gas emissions and all sectors comes from industry, both from direct burning of fuels, steam and other processes, but also from purchasing power from utilities. So it's both direct and indirect. Scope 1 and Scope 2 if you want. The annual growth rate of energy consumption of industry on average is higher than the average electricity growth rates of residential users. 24% of all energy is used by industry in developed countries, and 36% is used in emerging and developing economies. So the share of energy used by industry is higher in developing countries because they are on a faster track to build their economies and are also based traditionally and inherently, because they are in a status of developing, on energy-intensive products, steel, cement, etc. Less in our countries because we're more going into services. Half of all energy is consumed indirect as power, electricity, which is about 5.2 gigatons CO2, which I said before. About 85% of all energy used in industry is consumed by energy-intensive industries, it's about 50%, and other heavy manufacturing, such as industrial consumer goods, but also private consumer goods and car sectors. Only 15% is used by less energy-intensive and the service sector industries. Most industries have long-term power purchase agreements which are not disclosed. And that's important. If we want to work with companies to have them buying, purchasing clean energy, clean power in the future, they would not disclose unless they do it voluntarily. Many don't do that because they have preferential treatments. And they do not like their competitors in the public to know. Because most industry pays substantively less than residential captive customers per megawatt hour because they negotiate. Whereas captive customers have no choice. They're connected to the grid, boom. You get your electricity, boom, that's it, you pay your bill. A big customer, a chemical company can say, no, I don't want to talk to RWE, I talk to E.ON or to Vattenfall. They may give me preferential treatment. And that's where the bargaining starts. And then the price goes down and you say, well, you get a lower price if you make a contract for the next 10 years, and not only 5 years, and so on. It's the same as the gas market. And this is normal, it's a market. Whether we like it or not, but that's a market. The operational costs, and that's the reason why they get also lower prices, they want lower prices. The operational energy costs range from about 30% of all operational costs in industry, in particular aluminum and chemicals. 10% is industrial manufacturing and ICT, to below 5%, which are, for instance, some retailers. So some are much more energy intensive than others, and there's a quite range of graduation, so to speak. Power price estimates, and there are only estimates out there because there's no mandatory disclosure of what those companies are paying. And when I say these companies, I talk mainly about those 4,000 listed stock companies noted on the stock market, which only very few of those disclose what they are paying. Power prices estimates by scientists range from about 15% to 80% below the residential retail price in the respective country. One of the few countries that disclose the prices for industry is China, for instance. Well, that's a question of the system as well, but China is quite transparent. We know exactly what industry is paying per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour, if you want. Most utilities who finance as one cross-finance and subsidize low business tariffs. If you look at liberalization of energy markets, and the power market in particular, Europe is a very good example. So you have seen in the last 10 years that the overall prices for the captive consumer is stabilizing and even going up, whereas the prices for large consumers is going down. So we as individual consumers are subsidizing the large consumers of energy. You may say that is wonderful, we need to have that one because we need to keep them in a competitive market, fine. But still it's a fact, we do that. As a rule of thumb, the more one uses power, the longer the power purchase agreement, the cheaper is the megawatt hour and the lower the renewable energy share. That is a tendency from the literature. Keep that in mind. And if you look then, which sector uses how much energy in particular? Steel, aluminum, and chemicals use 23% of all energy. It's quite substantive. Industrial goods manufacturing, the Mitsubishis, the Toshibas, and so on, is 13%. Mining, BHP Billiton and others, 10%. Consumer goods production, the fridges, it's 10%. Retail, 9%. Cement, 5%. Car production, 5%. ICT is 4%. Food and beverage is 4%. Banks and finance, only 2%. And paper and pulp, though energy intensive, also only 2%. So if we have a focus on voluntary agreements, we need to look at the sectors where we get the biggest bang for the buck. And then looking in the sectors, in those individual companies, there's research out there which pretty much discloses which companies are the biggest consumers. I'm not showing that here, but some of the stuff is out there. So you focus on the right consumer, on the right company, not necessarily a company like a chemical company which is whining about the emission trading system, is whining about competitive losses, and is whining about high energy price, and is whining about the feed-in tariffs. No, you go to those which want to do something on renewables, which have a retail, let's say, brand issue, which have customer exposure. You don't go to those companies primarily, probably later on, which have business-to-business relations. They don't care for brand recognition, not as much as others. Companies of brand recognition care, in principle. It doesn't mean they react as we want, but they care, they are more open. I think that's important to keep in mind as a strategic approach. What do we see with corporate actions currently on climate and energy, on renewables? Well, we see mostly compliance. That's pretty boring and not what we want. We have very few pioneers for clean power, which do more than just compliance. To give you a number, and I checked the numbers lately with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the corporate owners, there are 6 gigawatts of wind power, which is additionally owned currently by corporate owners, in addition to what those companies would buy from the grid anyway, which is there anyway. The juice they get anyway from the plug. There are a couple of companies which buy additional wind. 6 gigawatt, sounds big, is not. This is lower than 3% of installed wind power capacity by beginning of 2012. And this wind power, is about 2.5% of all power produced. So wind power is growing quite substantively. Currently, it's 2.5% of power worldwide produced, based on the new figures from New Energy Finance. But it's very small what corporate owners are buying currently. And if I look at they're buying green electricity, they're doing that. In fact, if you check the numbers and look what they're really buying on top, what they get anyway, it's not much. Same with solar, with PV in this case. There's about 1 gigawatt roughly, which various companies are buying in addition to what they have to buy or get anyway from the grid. And this 1 gigawatt solar is currently about 1.5% of all installed PV by 2012. We have about 70 gigawatt installed PV worldwide. By the way, lots of it in Germany. So corporate actions on voluntarily purchasing renewable power is currently a sad story. But the potential is very high, in principle. The largest 3 companies of each sector of retail consume 71 terawatt hours. Of ICT, 37, food and beverage, 15, and just for comparison, steel, 135 terawatt hours. And note that the global industrial commercial power consumption is currently about 2,500 terawatt hours. Still big, but if some of those companies in those sectors, which I would believe are exposed to and are interested in doing something, they could be potential customers. Intervention options and necessities. The reason why wind and solar is growing is because of a steep manufacturing cost decline, double logarithmic cost curve with increased cumulative global capacity. Figures on PV, silicon modules worldwide, and onshore and offshore wind in Denmark and USA, you see the trend with cumulative global capacity quite substantively going down. So on the IPCC, at the same point in time, you see that some of the renewable energy technologies on the left side already lurk into the area in yellowish for electricity, heat, and transport of cost effectiveness compared to the conventional power mix or heat supply or transport supply. On the right side, you see the range. Some of the stuff is not cost competitive, but it's getting into the range of cost competitiveness. Some would talk in the electricity sector about increasingly grid parity. What was released a couple of days ago by Pew Center and Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the latest data on the investments. And that's why I'm saying the glass is half full. We're seeing, despite economic crisis, a substantive increase of investments in clean renewables, up to $240 billion equivalent worldwide in 2011, excluding large hydropower. This is mainly, as we'll see in a minute, solar and wind worldwide. Breakdown of the various technologies: wind, solar, biofuels, other renewables, and efficiency and low carbon tech services. You see that solar in yellowish and wind in blue run the show. Increasingly, solar PV is overtaking wind in the last year, in particular in Europe and in this country, in Germany and Italy. So that is where I'm saying it's half full. And the story is not just renewables growing in the normal countries, in China, US, Germany, period. No. It's growing everywhere, despite a slow rate. But there are about 65 countries now who have quite ambitious targets. People tend to forget that India last year increased its renewable energy investments by 700%, starting from a low base. I agree. But that are good signs. It's not just the usual suspects, and that's good. So the market is diversifying. And renewables are subjected to decreased prices further. Bloomberg, again, on solar photovoltaic experiences, going down by 2030, the typical exponential curve, and for offshore wind as well, between now and 2030, decreasing. The various lines differentiate between utility scale for PV and distance of offshore wind from the coast, because the cable costs play a role. Based on development, what Bloomberg New Energy Finance has projected, which is a business-as-usual light scenario, where you wouldn't have additional policy interventions. This is what happened between now and 2030 in terms of gigawatt capacity installment. Forget CCS. The show is run by solar and wind, based on currently observed trends. No additional funding. I mean, given the existing policies are being met, but no additional policies. It's a huge growth, it's a tenfold growth. 2,500 gigawatt roughly, or 2,000 gigawatt of wind and solar alone is about 40% of currently installed electric capacity. What Siemens, which is certainly not a tree-huggerish company, disclosed to people is that if trends, they're coming from the wind sector, that's fine. But for the story, I think it's very important. Siemens is saying basically the overall electricity consumption, billion kilowatt hours. Oops, it's okay. In 2006, with trends going on, offshore wind becoming cheaper and cheaper, will be that one. So by 2030, basically, what we consume as electricity now is being all produced by wind, both offshore and onshore, by 2030. Whether we like it or not, and we say solar plays a role, is not the point. The point is, as a large international company is saying, yes, guys, it's doable. Renewable electricity can deliver the major piece of power. Voluntary approaches, wind made, green labels, new certification, and then I stop. I got the message here. What we will do as WWF, we will work with companies to source substantially renewable energy sources up to 100%, as an additionally agreement with the companies to foster clean energy development. My colleague Bruce Haas is here somewhere. Talk to him. He's the champion on this project. So we will work with companies to make them a speaker for the clean course based on their practice and based on their green purchase behavior. We will support and strengthen windmate. I'm not talking about this one, Henrik will do this one. We will also develop, in order to strengthen windmate in the future, to develop criteria for sustainable hydro. We need to do that because hydropower is currently, and still remains for quite some time, 80% of all renewable power. And hydropower potentially has a very positive role to play in order to balance more variable renewable sources. And it can be done sustainable. It can also be done unsustainable. The same for sustainable biomass. That's what WWF is working on in the future. And we need to integrate more renewable sources, in particular solar, which is much less contentious than hydro or biomass, into windmate over time. I'm saying this, sorry Henrik if I say that one, but we've talked about this earlier. That's at least what we want as WWF, and we have been co-founding windmate, but we want a more generic label for renewable energies. And then, lastly, mark windmate as the key, or whatever the name then will be when those come. And maybe the name it won't be windmate anymore, maybe renewable mate, whatever the name will be. Make windmate the key renewable energy trademark label in the voluntary market for companies. I think that's very important to keep in mind, but let me finish. For us, it's important that voluntary schemes are very important to drive and push the top layers. But it's not enough to bring the laggards on the same level. The primacy of policy making is utmost important. It will never substitute policy making. Thank you very much.